Part 4 of St. Joan Preface by George Bernard Shaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4. The conflict between genius and discipline. Having thus brought the matter home to ourselves, we may now consider the special feature of Joan's mental constitution which made her so unmanageable. What is to be done on the one hand with rulers who will not give any reason for their orders, and on the other with people who cannot understand the reasons when they are given? The government of the world, political, industrial, and domestic, has to be carried on mostly by the giving and obeying of orders under just these conditions. "Don't argue, do as you're told," has to be said not only to children and soldiers, but practically to everybody. Fortunately, most people do not want to argue. They are only too glad to be saved the trouble of thinking for themselves. And the ablest and most independent thinkers are content to understand their own special department. In other departments, they will unhesitatingly ask for and accept the instructions of a policeman or the advice of a tailor without demanding or desiring explanations. Nevertheless, there must be some ground for attaching authority to an order. A child will obey its parents, a soldier his officer, a philosopher a railway porter, and a workman a foreman, all without question, because it is generally accepted that those who give the orders understand what they are about, and are duly authorized and even obliged to give them, and because, in the practical emergencies of daily life, there is no time for lessons and explanations, or for arguments as to their validity. Such obediences are as necessary to the continuous operation of our social system as the revolutions of the earth are to the succession of day and night. But they are not so spontaneous as they seem. They have to be very carefully arranged and maintained. A bishop will defer to and obey a king, but let a curate venture to give him an order, however necessary and sensible, and the bishop will forget his cloth and damn the curate's impudence. The more obedient a man is to accredited authority, the more jealous he is of allowing any unauthorized person to order him about. With all this in mind, consider the career of Joan. She was a village girl, in authority over sheep and pigs, dogs and chickens, and to some extent over her father's hired laborers when he hired any, but over no one else on earth. Outside the farm, she had no authority, no prestige, no claim to the smallest deference. Yet she ordered everybody about, from her uncle to the king, the archbishop, and the military general staff. Her uncle obeyed her like a sheep, and took her to the castle of the local commander, who, on being ordered about, tried to assert himself, but soon collapsed and obeyed. And so on up to the king, as we have seen. This would have been unbearably irritating, even if her orders had been offered as rational solutions of the desperate difficulties in which her social superiors found themselves just then. But they were not so offered, nor were they offered as the expression of Joan's arbitrary will. It was never "I say so," but always "God says so." Joan as theocrat. Leaders who take that line have no trouble with some people, and no end of trouble with others. They need never fear a lukewarm reception. Either they are messengers of God, or they are blasphemous impostors. In the Middle Ages, the general belief in witchcraft greatly intensified this contrast, because when an apparent miracle happened, as in the case of the wind changing at Orleans, it proved the divine mission to the credulous, and proved a contract with the devil to the skeptical. All through, Joan had to depend on those who accepted her as an incarnate angel against those who added to an intense resentment of her presumption a bigoted abhorrence of her as a witch. To this abhorrence we must add the extreme irritation of those who did not believe in the voices and regarded her as a liar and impostor. It is hard to conceive anything more infuriating to a statesman or a military commander, or to a court favorite, than to be overruled at every turn, or to be robbed of the ear of the reigning sovereign by an impudent young upstart practising on the credulity of the populace and the vanity and silliness of an immature prince by exploiting a few of those lucky coincidences which pass as miracles with uncritical people. Not only were the envy, snobbery, and competitive ambition of the baser natures exacerbated by Joan's success, but among the friendly ones that were clever enough to be critical, a quite reasonable skepticism and mistrust of her ability, founded on a fair observation of her obvious ignorance and temerity, were at work against her. And as she met all remonstrances and all criticisms, not with arguments or persuasion, but with a flat appeal to the authority of God, and a claim to be in God's special confidence, she must have seemed, to all who were not infatuated by her, so insufferable that nothing but an unbroken chain of overwhelming success in the military and political field could have saved her from the wrath that finally destroyed her. Unbroken success essential in theocracy. To forge such a chain, she needed to be the king, the Archbishop of Reims, the bastard of Orleans, and herself into the bargain, and that was impossible. From the moment when she failed to stimulate Charles to follow up his coronation with a swoop on Paris, she was lost. The fact that she insisted on this, whilst the king and the rest timidly and foolishly thought they could square the Duke of Burgundy and effect a combination with him against the English, made her a terrifying nuisance to them. And from that time onward she could do nothing but prowl about the battlefields, waiting for some lucky chance to sweep the captains into a big move. But it was to the enemy that the chance came. She was taken prisoner by the Burgundians fighting before Compiègne, and at once discovered that she had not a friend in the political world. Had she escaped, she would probably have fought on until the English were gone, and then had to shake the dust of the court off her feet, and retire to Domremy, as Garibaldi had to retire to Caprera. Modern distortions of Joan's history. This, I think, is all that we can now pretend to say about the prose of Joan's career. The romance of her rise, the tragedy of her execution, and the comedy of the attempts of posterity to make amends for that execution, belong to my play, and not to my preface, which must be confined to a sober essay on the facts. That such an essay is badly needed can be ascertained by examining any of our standard works of reference. They give accurately enough the facts about the visit to Vaucouleurs, the annunciation to Charles at Chinon, the raising of the siege of Orleans, and the subsequent battles, the coronation at Reims, the capture at Compiègne, and the trial and execution at Rouen, with their dates and the names of the people concerned, but they all break down on the melodramatic legend of the wicked bishop and the entrapped maiden and the rest of it. It would be far less misleading if they were wrong as to the facts and right in their view of the facts. As it is, they illustrate the too little considered truth that the fashion in which we think changes like the fashion of our clothes, and that it is difficult, if not impossible, for most people to think otherwise than in the fashion of their own period. History always out of date. This, by the way, is why children are never taught contemporary history. Their history books deal with periods of which the thinking has passed out of fashion, and the circumstances no longer apply to active life. For example, they are taught history about Washington and told lies about Lenin. In Washington's time, they were told lies, the same lies, about Washington and taught history about Cromwell. In the 15th and 16th centuries, they were told lies about Joan, and by this time might very well be told the truth about her. Unfortunately, the lies did not cease when the political circumstances became obsolete. The Reformation, which Joan had unconsciously anticipated, kept the questions which arose in her case burning up to our own day. You can see plenty of the burnt houses still in Ireland, with the result that Joan has remained the subject of anti-clerical lies, of specifically Protestant lies, and of Roman Catholic evasions of her unconscious Protestantism. The truth sticks in our throats with all the sauces it is served with. It will never go down until we take it without any sauce at all. The real Joan, not marvelous enough for us. But even in its simplicity, the faith demanded by Joan is one which the anti-metaphysical temper of 19th century civilization, which remains powerful in England and America and is tyrannical in France, contemptuously refuses her. We do not, like her contemporaries, rush to the opposite extreme in a recoil from her as from a witch self-sold to the devil, because we do not believe in the devil, nor in the possibility of commercial contracts with him. Our credulity, though enormous, is not boundless, and our stock of it is quite used up by our mediums, clairvoyants, hand-readers, slate-writers, Christian scientists, psychoanalysts, electronic vibration diviners, therapeutists of all schools, registered and unregistered, astrologers, astronomers who tell us that the sun is nearly 100 million miles away, and the Betelgeuse is 10 times as big as the whole universe, physicists who balance Betelgeuse by describing the incredible smallness of the atom, and a host of other marvel-mongers whose credulity would have dissolved the Middle Ages in a roar of skeptical merriment. In the Middle Ages, people believed that the earth was flat, for which they had at least the evidence of their senses. We believe it to be round, not because as many as 1% of us could give the physical reasons for so quaint a belief, but because modern science has convinced us that nothing that is obvious is true, and that everything that is magical, improbable, extraordinary, gigantic, microscopic, heartless, or outrageous is scientific. I must not, by the way, be taken as implying that the earth is flat, or that all or any of our amazing credulities are delusions or impostures. I am only defending my own age against the charge of being less imaginative than the Middle Ages. I affirm that the 19th century, and still more the 20th, can knock the 15th into a cocked hat in point of susceptibility to marvels and saints and prophets and musicians and monsters and fairy tales of all kinds. The proportion of marvel to immediately credible statements in the latest edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica is enormously greater than in the Bible. The medieval doctors of divinity, who did not pretend to settle how many angels could dance on the point of a needle, cut a very poor figure as far as romantic credulity is concerned beside the modern physicists who have settled to the billionth of a millimeter every movement and position in the dance of the electron. Not for worlds would I question the precise accuracy of these calculations or the existence of electrons, whatever they may be. The fate of Joan is a warning to me against such heresy. But why the men who believe in electrons should regard themselves as less credulous than the men who believed in angels is not apparent to me. If they refuse to believe, with the Rouen assessors of 1431, that Joan was a witch, it is not because that explanation is too marvelous, but because it is not marvelous enough. The stage limits of historical representation. For the story of Joan, I refer the reader to the play which follows. It contains all that need be known about her, but as it is for stage use, I have had to condense into 3½ hours a series of events which in their historical happening were spread over 4 times as many months. For the theatre imposes unities of time and place from which nature in her boundless wastefulness is free. Therefore, the reader must not suppose that Joan really put Robert de Baudricourt in her pocket in 15 minutes, nor that her excommunication, recantation, relapse, and death at the stake were a matter of half an hour or so. Neither do I claim more for my dramatizations of Joan's contemporaries than that some of them are probably slightly more like the originals than those imaginary portraits of all the popes from St. Peter onward through the Dark Ages, which are still gravely exhibited in the Uffizi in Florence, or were when I was there last. My Dunois would do equally well for the Duc d'Alençon. Both left descriptions of Joan so similar that, as a man always describes himself unconsciously whenever he describes anyone else, I have inferred that these good-natured young men were very like one another in mind, so I have lumped the twain into a single figure,